"We shouldn't go," Jesse Waller said before the three set off that morn. "Them's the butcher's woods." Now, Jesse Waller lay dead on the ground, nearly a mile into Butcher's Woods. Gazing out from the abandoned shack, Tony Boone could clearly see him. He lay not 10 feet from the front door, blood running from his gashed neck. He was only 10 feet from safety. It stood right above him. The butcher. It was everything their grandparents had warned them about when they were kids. But now, it was more than just fanciful, terrible stories. Now it was real. Something palpable. Now, it had just murdered one of Tony's oldest friends. The beast was an ill shade of white with taut skin that was thin enough to almost be translucent. It hovered above Jesse's body almost like a wolf, leaning forward to bring its lengthy snout just inches away from Jesse's lifeless eyes. The butcher had no eyes, and no eyes could be seen at all on its face. The only orifice visible was a small human-like mouth at the end of its horse-like snout. The mouth opened, and a black tongue emerged from between the very human teeth. It licked the blood from Jesse's throat with a wide smile. Feeling like he wanted to scream, Tony turned from the window and slid down the shack's mossy wall. He shook as his mouth gaped, struggling to breathe. Silent tears warmed his cheek. Hearing the creature snort, he turned his gaze back outside. He'd been so shocked seeing Jesse murdered right in front of him, he had almost forgotten what the creature still held beneath its front arms. The third member of their party. The man who was still alive, Bill Dixon. One of its mighty, clawed hands clamped shut around his face so he couldn't scream. Beneath the butcher's weight, the scrawny man could only do so much. Tony could only watch as the young man's hands flailed in short, spastic attacks that failed to accomplish anything. He couldn't even faze the large beast. He was completely at the butcher's mercy, and Tony knew from those old stories his grandpappy used to tell him by the fireplace what happens next. He could see it on the creature's back, along the creature's backbone and sides. Sprouted about a dozen terrible spines. Each one, probably as large as an elephant's tusk, looked like it had been carved out of bone and sharpened to a razor's edge. A few were broken, snapped at the base. They splintered like logs. Bloodstains stretched across a handful that were intact, but on a few of them, bloodstains stretched across a handful that were intact, but on a few of them, they still carried more than bloodstains. 2 of the spikes held flesh, dangling from them, the remains of the last 2 unfortunate individuals to cross the butcher's path. "There's a reason why they call it the butcher," Tony mouthed in fear. "It's because it saves its meat on hooks for later." The nearly skeletal remains hung from the butcher's spines like puppets. With little sinews and cloth remained were all that held the two together, and Tony could see where tooth and claws had ripped and pulled bare flesh off what had been once 2 men. In a moment that made Tony's eyes widen, a realization cruelly barged into his racing mind. It came to Tony when the beast had reared itself up like a bear, with Jesse in one hand and still struggling clasped Bill in the other. Tony realized what was about to happen. When it did happen, Tony had to gag himself with his own muddy hand to keep his screams in check. It started with Jesse, since he struggled the least. Holding him in its right hand, the creature contorted its joints to bring Jesse to rest on a spine that protruded right behind a beast's near visible ribs on the side closest to the shack. Tony winced as the spine entered Jesse's corpse with a sickening crunch. The creature released, allowing Jesse's body to settle onto the slightly upward tilted spike. Jesse's head dangled and swayed, his matted brown hair covering his face. But then, Tony started to shake his head back away from the window when the creature placed both its evil hands on Bill's shoulders. "No," Bill shouted, his mouth finally free and his voice cracking. "No, don't you do it. Please, don't you do... Help! Help! Anyone, please help!" Tony saw as the creature, holding Bill just in front of his wicked chest, turned Bill around so that he was facing the forest. Tony saw as the creature started bringing its arms in slowly, pulling Bill towards its chest. Tony saw the one jagged-edged spine that protruded right from the creature's sternum. It was cruel how slowly it happened, and Tony knew that the butcher intended to be so. As Bill screamed, Tony couldn't help but watch as the creature drove the spine through his best friend's torso. The screams, the wails were unimaginable. Tony could taste blood in his mouth as his aching teeth sunk into his own numb flesh. He wanted to do something, anything but what? There had been 3 of them once. Now it was just him. And the butcher knew that too. Tony had no time to mourn, to weep, for the creature allotted no time for grieving. It had 2 of the 3 transgressors, and now it needed the 3rd. Tony ducked from the darkest corner of the shed as the butcher scuffled close. It leaned, craning its long neck towards the window. It searched for him, using only God knew what unseen senses. Tony curled up in the protective cover of shadow, scarcely breathing, waiting for it to leave. All the while, Bill showed no signs of dying, for his screams, curses, and shouts still carried strong on the wind. "Help! Oh God, please! Oh, it hurts! It's killing me, please!" As the trembling Tony waited, he listened as Bill's pleads started to change. "Tony," he screamed pleadingly. "Tony, if you can hear me, run. You gotta run, Tony. Don't let it find you. You gotta run." Tony didn't want to. The last thing he wanted was to leave them. Jesse deserved better. He deserved to be buried at home where his family could see him. And to leave Bill like that, to leave him alive in that thing's clutches, Tony would almost rather die. But if he could make it, get back home, he could rally more hunters than those woods had ever known. He could make the butcher rue the day he thought. He could make it rue everything. He could avenge his friends. Or you could survive, whispered a darker voice inside his head, and stay away. The butcher circled the shack many times, searching for something, anything. Tony could feel its frustration growing as it growled beyond the doors, as it swiped its claws at the shack's wooden frame. It knew he was close, but it didn't know where. Eventually, and to Tony's initial disbelief, the butcher retreated. Tony could tell as its heavy footfalls fell away and Bill's tormented cries faded into the distance. When everything had grown silent except for the bird calls and the rustling of leaves in the wind, and it had been that way for a good long while. Tony made his move. Cautiously, he pushed open the shack's door, peered into the woods. It must have been past noon, but the mist that morning had brought still hung thick between the trees. But Tony wasn't expecting to rely on his sight. He was expecting to rely almost completely on his ears. As he ran, sprinted, bolted the mile back out of the woods, he listened. It nearly froze him to the spot the first time, but it happened just as he expected it would. Like a siren coming from the distance. He heard Bill's cries echo out as the creature galloped closer. It happened once, twice, again and again, and each time Bill's cries saved Tony's life. If he thought he heard them in the distance for even a moment, Tony would duck for cover and cower underneath some log or with some rotted tree basin until the distant wails once again faded to the horizon. Then he would start again. It stretched the mile into the nearly infinity, having to stop so often. It turned every several hundred feet into a lifetime, but he persisted. It almost sickened him, using his friend the way he did. You do what you have to, he thought to himself. You do what you have to get out of here, to survive. He had originally told himself he would survive for Bill, for Jesse. Yet the closer Tony got to the forest's edge, the less and less he wanted to ever return. Each time Bill's scream faded, it became easier and easier to forget, to find that drive to survive. It ate him up inside, but Tony never intended to come back. I'm sorry, he whispered as the edge of the forest approached. It was my fault we even came here. The trees were about to break. He hadn't heard the beast. He hadn't heard Bill in what felt like hours. I'll never make that mistake again. He tripped right before he made it to the opening. Crawling toward, he tried to keep the momentum moving as he rolled onto his back and kicked at the leaves with his feet. Logic told him it was a branch, a stump, a root of the mighty oak he just passed. He could have tripped on anything. Instinctively, however, he knew what had happened before he hit the ground. He looked to the broad oak and to its shadow. That's where it stood on its hind legs, heaving mighty warm breaths. Crouched ever so slightly forward, it held its hands on Bill's wiggling form. One was cupped over his mouth, the other around his still squirming throat. It had silenced him. It had waited, craning its neck down right beside Bill's cherry red face. It tilted its head almost inquisitively. Its lips audibly split. Its smile was indescribable, with simply any other word but wicked.